Okay, I'm going to try not to rush through this if I can help it, but want to make sure that I cover some of the main themes that people have identified in this novel over the last years since it was written. We talked a little bit about identity, and that's important, especially with respect to people's names and the communities they come out of, and those names bear significance. In a way, we kind of all sort of, if you have a nickname or if you're from a culture that believes a lot in nicknames. I am. Nicknaming is kind of a way of renaming yourself, although you kind of don't usually pick it. Somebody picks it for you. It's almost like a do-over in some ways. But anyway, it helps shape our identity, doesn't it? What you're called from a small age, is a younger age, shapes who you are. The novel is exploring how do we become what we are. Now, if you look at characters, and there's so many of them that I can just list a few, Paul D. and what he had to go through, especially after the war, right? Being imprisoned and being treated like an animal, being hunted by the Klan, all of those things. He says that he has, instead of a heart, he has a tobacco box, right? Back in the day when people used to not, when you smoked cigarettes, you'd roll your own cigarettes and tobacco came in a tin box, right? Or you'd put it in a tin box with, cigarette papers, and you'd make your own and then you'd smoke it. So he's got a tobacco box for a heart, and all the grief and all the suffering and all the trauma goes in that tobacco box that he has instead of a heart, right? He's been changed, irreparably because of what he's gone through. So has Setha. She has gone through so much, it's almost impossible to list it. Baby Suggs as well. So all of the characters, their identity is shaped by the community and by the trauma that they go through. Your identity is determined largely by the people you know and the people who influence you, right? So when dislocation happens, and it doesn't just happen to people, of this particular community and at this particular historical time, this is said obviously, right after the Civil War, but it goes back in time during the Civil War to talk about what happened to these characters and how awful it was and what it did to them. It's not about just what happened to them. What it did to them is really the focus, I think, of the novel. It's not just a list of terrible things that happen. It's the impact of that. You see this in other Morrison novels as well. I invite you to read The Bluest Eye if you never have. It's a super important novel. But it's about what does that trauma do to you when, and how does it shape you? How does it make you who you are? And what happens to us when our connection is ripped apart? You see this because, one way we're reminded of this, and people should be reminded of this, is that slavery was an institution that destroyed families, not just black families, but white families as well. During slavery times, the vows that a woman and a man who were enslaved would say to each other frequently said, "Until death or distance do us part," right? In other words, you could be sold. Your husband or wife could be sold. Your children could be sold. They were sold, right? And this destroyed and ripped families apart. Setha has no real relationship with her biological mother. She doesn't have it. And of course, her biological mother eventually is killed. She's hanged. But she has no relationship with her. She doesn't really know her. And so she has a sort of a surrogate mother. That's a central thing in the novel as well. Obviously, motherhood and how important that is, etc. Everyone talks about that, of course, that and the racial overtones, the racial implications, the historical racism that the novel tries to bring up. But this could easily be a novel that explores the same things about identity and dislocation and trauma, and be set, for example, in 1930s Germany, or in some other part of the world or some other time period. So I don't think the reason I bring this up is because, yes, it is a novel about America, about race, about slavery, about all of that, because that's the community that Morrison comes out of. But I think it sells the novel short to say that it's just about that. It's not. I think she's trying to say something about the universal human condition and how when we become dislocated from our community, from our family, which is the most central nuclear relationship that we have is family, when people, any people, all people, when you become dislocated or ripped apart like that, how do you reconstruct, your sense of identity? This is super important. And it comes in with Beloved herself, because Beloved is a child that has no identity. It was only here for a short time, right, before she was killed. She has no identity. She has no name, no real name. Who do I belong to? Now, obviously, this leads over into the second theme, which is the supernatural. You kind of have to suspend your disbelief. If you don't believe in ghosts and stuff, then this is probably a book that you're going to maybe poo-poo a little bit. But suspend your disbelief for a moment, because there are lots of reasons to take the novel seriously, even if you're somebody who doesn't believe in sort of ghosts and goblins and whatever. Because in this novel, the supernatural world coexists with the natural world. It intersects, it overlaps, it intervenes. And you say, well, didn't anybody in the novel think, well, there's no such thing as ghosts? This is nonsense. There should be some scientific explanation of this. Two things about that. Number one, we are invited to take these people for who they are, right? And who they are and part of their culture. And this is true with people throughout time, not just African American folks in the 19th century, but throughout time have believed in the supernatural. The Irish believe in fairies and leprechauns and pukas and banshees and all kinds of things, right? They too in Celtic mythology believe in this overlapping of the natural and the supernatural. It just so happens that tradition that Morrison is tapping into, because it's part of her tradition and she's quite open about it, is a legacy of her family and her family's legacy from Africa. Okay. The idea that the spirit world is here with us at all times. And you can't separate the natural from the supernatural, right? This is a big thing. It's part of like explaining, for example, Baby Suggs' preaching and her spiritualism, that there is a link that she's trying to connect here, even if it's rather evanescent, right? There's a big word for you. Look it up. Evanescent. Even if it's rather tenuous or not specific, I should say, or suggested rather than overt. That these beliefs within the African American community have their origins centuries ago in African spiritualism, folklore, and culture. Right? Do you remember early on when the folks were dancing and the dances looked very different? She describes them in a way that is very unique, and those dances unquestionably came from African dances. And we know this to be the case. If you ever study this, it's really cool. Language and tradition and culture and folklore and all kinds of things within African American families go back centuries. That is still there. There will be people who will tell you that all got eradicated. Not at all. Not at all. As a matter of fact, just to give you a little vocabulary lesson, all of these words are African in origin. Juke, jazz, okra, banjo, all these words are African words. They're West African words. The broomstick tradition in African American weddings dates back to African tradition. There's just all kinds of stuff between dance and culture and language. All of that was not preserved like in a pristine museum-like quality, but it made it across the Atlantic. It made it because people preserved it. And Morrison's wanting to tap into that. And part of it is this presentation of the spirit world is something that is accepted by the characters in her novel because that comes from It has an origin. It has a place of origin, right? Both in time and space. Okay. So the spiritual, the supernatural, and how it informs us as well. We're not complete without the supernatural. Notice this in the characters in this novel. They're not complete unless they resolve something that's going on with the supernatural. The supernatural has a way of making us deal with it. Right? And Beloved shows up, doesn't she? And we're going to talk about that more as well. And also, when we get to symbolism, we'll get to that in a moment. Very important supernatural, spiritual symbols as well. Time is probably, I think, one of the most important themes in here. And it's sometimes not, it's overlooked by a lot of critics. I don't know why, but it's just in your face. Places and people are how characters order things and make sense of things in this novel, not time. Now, this is getting deep here, okay? Most of us think and we read narratives in a chronological fashion. This happened first, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? This novel doesn't work that way, and to the frustration of a lot of readers, they say, well, now, wait a minute, now all of a sudden we're back before the Civil War. How did that happen, right? And I think one of the subtexts of the novel is we don't know things that we know. We aren't who we are based on time constructing us. It's places and people who construct who we are, right? I know this is really deep. Okay, this is why it's a great novel. That we're not who we are because we lived a sequence of events. It's the events, right? And specifically the people and places that make us who we are, not the sequence of events that we go through, okay? So that makes a little sense because, here's the thing, gonna get deeper, the past is in the present as well because every day we're alive, our past exists in us, right? It never leaves us. Here it is, it haunts us, okay? Beloved, okay? So it takes a couple of minutes to kind of process, like, what? But I think that's one of the things that she's getting at. And again, like I said, this is about Morrison writing about characters that she identifies with as part of her history, her heritage, her community. But it could be about any group. It could be about any group. It happens to be about this one, right? It happens to be about African Americans, but it could be about any group. She's trying to make a bigger statement than just about herself, her experience, her culture's experience. And that's what makes a piece of literature great, is if it has what I call universality, okay? That anybody can relate to it. The novel can be confusing because it progresses not chronologically, but psychically. And I don't mean like psychic, like tarot cards, but I mean psychically as in mentally, cognitively, and spiritually. That it progresses in terms of the mental state of the characters, not a 1, 2, 3, 4, this, before, during, after sequence. Okay? So time is secondary in a way to what has happened, not when, what has happened, and who happened to you, not when you encountered them. Okay? So we get some examples of this. For example, 124, there's no street name for this house. It's just 124. Okay? By the way, I misspoke in the first video. I am a child of the 70s. When I said that Sweet Home was in Alabama instead of Kentucky, I'm sorry, Sweet Home Alabama was a big song back in the 70s when I was a teenager, so you'll have to forgive me. But they're in Kentucky. They were enslaved in Kentucky. They go over to Cincinnati. They don't even live in Cincinnati. They live some ambiguous distance outside of the city at 124, right? No street name. Setha, Denver, Baby, Paul D. They're all important, but the lines of time get blurred because in the end, it doesn't matter what happened first, second, or third. What matters is what it did, what it did to you, right? And what it made you, and how it made you what you are today, right? I know I'm getting really deep into this, but if you do some thinking about this and you read this and look at these events and say, wait a minute, the point is not to give me, a sort of Mary Had a Little Lamb and the Three Little Pigs here. The point is to tell me who these people are and how they got that way. right? And you'll see this, like I said, in other stories and nonfiction works between Margaret Fuller or Mary Rowlandson or Anne Bradstreet or any of these folks. They're talking to you about what happened to them, and the time is not as important as the place or the event. Okay, so let's move on quickly while I've still got time to talk a little bit about symbolism. There's a lot of it in the novel, and we can identify several different things. But first of all, Setha's scar. Where did it come from? What does it mean? Okay, it's shaped like a tree. Obviously, it's from the whipping, the beating that she received, and that's because of a traumatic event that happened to her in the form of a sexual assault that she said something about, and I guess that was the consequence of her actually saying something, is that she was actually punished for something that others did to her. But it's important that it's in the form of a tree, and trees are living things, right? They're living things. We see them as life-giving. As much difficulty and horror that Setha has had to go through, she is a creature who gives life. So let's don't overlook that. We always want to look at the victim and say, oh, this is just a terrible, sad... Wait a minute. Time out here. What are the ways in which Setha has been a victor, right? Because you can say that. 124, that house, houses are always symbols of stuff. Even going back to the House of the Seven Gables or whatever, always houses are symbolic of something, of a family, right? We even say the house of so-and-so, the house of Windsor, etc. And what we really mean by that is the family, don't we? And so the house is kind of symbolic of the family. It's where people live. It goes, all of that kind of stuff. Think about that. The river, the Ohio River, right, that separates Kentucky, which was a slave state, from Ohio, which was a free state, and the struggle that Setha and others go through to escape that darkness of slavery and get across that river. But the river is important too, because water is a spiritual symbol, isn't it? Think about it. Cleansing, not just physically cleansing, but spiritually. Baptism, for example, right? How does beloved emerge from ghost to corporal, right, bodily human being? She comes up out of the river. She raises up out of the river. She's resurrected out of the river. Okay, and becomes an embodied person and not just a spirit. Of course, that disintegrates with time. But she does it coming out of the river, right? When Denver, right, is born, the boat is sinking. She gives birth to this child. It's almost like a water birth, right? Some women have children, they do it underwater, right? For men who've never heard of this are like, what? You're going to drown that baby. No. You can give birth as a water birth, and then the child comes up. When that happens, it's a kind of like baptism at the moment of birth for Denver. Okay. All of this is really deep stuff. Okay. You can really go with it, really run with it. And then of course you've got Beloved herself, who is a symbol of, wow, everything. She is symbolic of all of the pain that haunts us from our past. All of the things in our life. You're all young. You got your whole life ahead of you. I hope you have many, many happy years. When you get to be somebody my age, you look back and you think about things that gave you joy in your life, but you also look back with things that were difficult and that gave you regret, right? We all have that. So I'm making the case not just for this character and this novel and this event. I'm making the case that Beloved is a novel about how do we all process the past, because it's still with us. You are a product of your past every day. And this is no more apparent than when you meet somebody who had something happen to him or her and you're like, man, you just got to get over it. And that's easier said than done. I know people whose whole lives have been changed because of one thing that happened to them, and they're just never going to be the same again. And that could be terrible, or it could just be bad luck. It could be horrible, or it could just be bad luck. In an instant, your life changes because of something. Or it could be something that's not even negative. It just changed the way you view things. I'll give you a little bit of an example. My grandparents were born right at the beginning of the 20th century. They lived through the Great Depression, and it was a scarring experience for my grandfather in particular, who had a home with 3 small children and a wife, and he lost his job and he lost his home. They became homeless. They had to move in with family, etc. And it took a few years for him to get a job again. And when he did, he showed up at a place where they were hiring a handful of guys. 100, as the story goes, 100 young men were there. And the guy who owned the business said, if you don't have children, please step to the back. And the reason was because he said, if I hire people who don't have children, one guy eats. If I hire somebody who has a family, 4 or 5 of them eat. So I'm only going to hire married men with children because they have to have the job. That's how bad things were. That's how badly people needed jobs. And once my grandfather got back up on his feet, he bought a home. It was a modest home. It was 1,000 square feet. It didn't have air conditioning. He put the cabinets in himself. It had a carport, not a garage. And he got a 10-year mortgage, and he paid it off in 7. Every night, I guarantee you, when he came home from working hour after hour after hour for that guy, Mr. Hegel, he would sit and put his head on that pillow, and I guarantee I know what he was thinking. He was thinking, got to pay the mortgage off, got to pay the mortgage off, because I'm never going to lose this house again. I'm never going to do it. I'm never going to look into the faces of my kids who are hungry and say, how am I going to feed them? That changes you. It really changes you. By the way, here's a thing that's really out of the past. When you came into his house, the man who hired him and kept him employed all those years in the middle of the Great Depression, you never said a bad word about Mr. Hegel. You never did. Not in his house, or he would throw you out. That man gave me a job when my children were hungry. The Great Depression, for example, though not as traumatic as slavery, is another example of how people, that one event, I'm never the same. That whole generation was never the same again. Never, right? The generation of Jews and other people who went through the Holocaust, they're never the same. Their whole lives change because of it. They look at, my grandfather and grandmother, they kept money in the house. They didn't trust banks because the banks failed in the Depression, right? So I think what Morrison is trying to show us here is the residual impact. Throw a pebble in a pond and see it ripple for a long time, right? So what happened in the 16, 17, 1800s in this country with not just African Americans, but a lot of people of color, and some other groups to a lesser extent. The Irish were treated terribly here. They were just awful towards the Irish. But particularly with slavery, it's not over. The impact is still there. When we look at things like employment and other opportunities and the African-American family and the crises that are happening, not just with all of our families, frankly, but in the African-American community, I think Morrison's trying to make a statement that the past is still with us. We're not over this yet, because it echoes and re-echoes through different generations. I think this is really an important thing that you get about the novel. We're going to get into some more specifics about the novel in our in-class, right, face-to-face class that I hope we'll bring up. There's just tons of stuff. We won't have time to do it all. I really should probably do like 2 weeks on this, but y'all might get bored. But anyway, let's move on to this, the quiz and other matters. All right, so we got an online quiz. Got 3 quiz questions. There they are. Why does Setha choose to marry Hallie or Holly? Out of all the Sweet Home men, she marries him. Why does she choose to do so? Okay, very important. It's very explicit in there. What does Denver see when she watches Setha praying? She walks in on her praying and she sees something. What does she see? And then how does Setha get the tree on her back? Be specific, like what was the series of events that led to her getting those scars, okay? The quiz, and I've got the discussion up, are both due before midnight on December 6th, so please try to get that done by then. We'll have a big quiz on Thursday covering the rest of the novel. Okay, so please try to finish out the rest of the novel. The final exam questions are now posted on Canvas. You should be able to access those, and we'll talk a little bit about those in class. Let me give you just a brief rundown. You're going to get 4 questions. You're going to be asked to, and at 8 a.m. on the 15th, I'm going to tell you which 2 I want you to write on. One of the 2 is going to be from the first 2 questions. One of the 2, the other of the 2 is going to be from the second 2 questions. So one question will come from 1 or 2. The other question will come from 3 or 4. Okay, and you'll have all the way up till midnight on the 15th to get that into me. Okay. Now, a final word about the film. listen, you'll notice that Oprah Winfrey stars in it. So does Danny Glover. There are a couple of other stars in there that you might recognize. All great actors. It was a good attempt. It was a good attempt. But I want you to think in the back of your mind, what would be the big challenge of doing this novel in film form and making it believable? It's a tough novel to put on the screen. I'll be honest with you. I think they did as good as they could, but pretty universally it was seen as a great attempt, but the text itself. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Maybe you'll watch it and like it. You can still access it online easily. You video pirates, hacking away and not paying what you should, I'm sure. But you can rent it if you want, if you're old like me and believe in obeying the law and respecting royalties. It's an interesting attempt, right? Sometimes you look at film because you watch a film because it's a great film. Sometimes you watch a film because it didn't work, but it's instructive to watch it and ask the question, okay, so why didn't it work? You may like it. You may like it. I think most people, and I'm in that group, looked at it and said, I just don't know how you could have done this. Because it is such a different kind of novel that it's just, how could you have done it and not deviated a lot? And the movie does deviate. It has to deviate a lot. It has to leave a lot out. It has to do stuff that, when you're dealing with the supernatural, can look a little corny and cheesy. Right. I also don't think that they cast the right girl for the part of Beloved, and I don't think she does a very good job on it. Oprah is an okay actress. She's not a great actress. She had a great bond with Morrison. They were just like inseparable. Morrison made an enormous impact on Oprah Winfrey's life and her career. And she was passionate about bankrolling the film, and that's good. But she also was passionate about wanting to play the lead. I'm not sure it was a great choice. Anyway, you can watch the film if you have the time. I really encourage you to do it. And even if you walk away saying, I didn't really like it or I didn't think it was very successful, at least you'll see an example of how maybe a film was trying to do something great, but it just had a lot of obstacles, right? Okay, all right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in class on Thursday.